Welcome. Today we're setting sail across the turbulent, fragmented world of the early Middle Ages. We're tracing the incredible journey of the Norse people, a phenomenon that just burst out of Scandinavia and fundamentally reshaped the political map of Europe.
And they didn't just raid. That's the key thing to get out of your head right away. They settled, they traded, and they laid the foundation for one of the most consequential dynasties in Western history.
Absolutely. This particular podcast is tailored for you, the listener, and we're focusing on the sheer expansive reach of the Norse, how they masterfully used the sea and these huge river systems to get deep inland.
And found powerful new political entities. Everything from the urban center of Jorvik in England all the way to the fledgling Rus kingdoms in the east.
But our core mission today, you could say, is tracing this history to one specific, highly consequential settlement, Normandy, and that remarkable transformation of Vikings into Normans, stopping right at the threshold of 1066.
And that mission is absolutely crucial. Because the Viking Age, which, spans roughly from AD 793 to 1200, is so often just reduced to the simple narrative of maritime terror.
Right, just pirates with axes.
Exactly. But if we look closer at the scale of their movement, the sheer distances they covered, and the permanent political structures they built, you see that Viking activity was incredibly complex.
So it was more than just raiding.
So much more. It was a sustained, often simultaneous migration and conquest, and it was driven by multiple overlapping motives: economic, political, and just simple necessity back home.
Okay, and understanding those layers is key to grasping why their settlements, especially Normandy, managed to, well, to endure and thrive where others failed.
It's the whole story.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the literal vehicle, the enabling technology of this massive explosion of activity. Without this crucial innovation, the entire Viking Age just doesn't happen.
The longship.
The longship. It was an absolute marvel of its time, really benefiting from generations of accumulated knowledge and innovations in maritime technology during the late Iron Age.
And it gave the Vikings this multifaceted advantage that their rivals, the centralized kingdoms of the Franks or the Anglo-Saxons, they just couldn't match it.
These weren't just fast boats, were they?
No, not at all. They were engineered for maximum tactical versatility. When we look at the excavated ships, like the Augsburg or Gokstad vessels, the brilliance is in their unique hull design.
How so?
They were constructed using the clinker method, where the planks overlapped. This made the hull surprisingly flexible and strong, especially in rough seas. But the key feature, the real game changer, was the shallow draft.
Meaning how deep it sat in the water.
Precisely. The amount of the boat that was submerged was minimal.
And that shallow draft is what changed everything, right? It meant they could pull right up onto a beach, no harbor necessary. But more importantly, it allowed them to bypass all the coastal defenses.
And sailed deep inland. They used the rivers, the Seine, the Loire, the Thames, the Volga, these rivers that should have been natural military borders for the defending kingdoms.
They became highways for Viking attack,
Right.
and eventually for settlement.
Exactly. And adding to that versatility, the longships, despite being sturdy, were light enough that they could actually be carried over land between river systems.
That's the practice of portaging, right?
Yes, portaging. And you have to imagine the sheer logistical effort involved. Hundreds of men dragging a massive warship, maybe 70 feet long, across muddy fields or forest paths just to bypass a waterfall or connect two separate waterways.
Wow. That meant they could cross continental divides and appear where they were least expected. It turns landlocked regions into sudden theaters of war.
And when they were on the water, the speed was staggering. These weren't slow barges. They were optimized for speed under sail and oar, which enabled incredibly efficient, highly targeted hit-and-run attacks.
And how fast are we talking?
The research suggests their maximum speed was prodigious for the time. We're estimating around 14 to 15 knots, which is about 26 to 28 kilometers per hour.
That combination of speed, shallow draft, and being able to carry the boat, it made any coastal or riverine city vulnerable, even protected centers like Paris or London.
They could strike, collect loot, and be back out to sea before a large, slow-moving land army could ever hope to intercept them.
So the longship explains the mechanism of expansion. But we need to talk about the why, the multiplicity of motives. We have to break down why these people decided to risk everything to leave their homelands.
Right. It wasn't just the smash and grab that we see depicted in movies. There was this complex, interlocking set of economic and social drivers.
And we really have to challenge that simple narrative of murderous heathens, which comes primarily from who? The monks they were raiding.
Of course. It was delivered by the monastic victims of the raids. But scholars, like Henri Pirenne, suggested early on that Norse activity was heavily rooted in merchant ventures. Before the major raids started in the late 8th century, the Norse were already seasoned maritime traders, explorers, and merchants.
Was the trade really that extensive, though? Often when we discuss trade, people think of occasional luxury goods, but you're suggesting a systemic foundational economy.
Absolutely. The evidence for extensive trading actually predates the major raiding period. We see the rapid emergence of significant trade sites around the Baltic Sea area even before 8800, like the major center of Ladokopen in present-day Sweden.
So this wasn't just a side hustle.
No, it was a sophisticated economy. I mean, to prove the level of their dedication, you have to consider the archaeological evidence. The discovery of over 100 collapsible scales in Sweden alone.
Collapsible scales.
Yes, complex measuring instruments based on an Islamic system of weights dating from around AD 696.
Wow. Using an Islamic system of weights centuries before many major raids even started. That speaks to incredible mercantile reach and sophisticated logistics.
It does. And the trade goods weren't exclusively luxury items either. They dealt in everyday commodities necessary for life. Soapstone for cooking vessels, horn and bone items, furs, amber.
And this mercantile activity created a critical cycle, I'd imagine.
A perfect cycle. Trade provided valuable intelligence about foreign lands, their wealth centers, their defenses, which in turn financed later larger raids. Those raids, of course, earned immediate profit and power, which was then reinvested in more ships and more trade.
But beyond the sheer economics, the social and political dynamics back home must have been a major push factor. If they were trading successfully, why risk life and limb on a raid?
There was significant domestic pressure. The historian Adam of Bremen noted that the poverty and unfruitfulness of their northern lands often forced Danes and Norwegians to seek riches elsewhere. It was a simple matter of survival.
And population pressure, too.
Yes, history tells us of localized population growth coupled with better crop production, which, paradoxically, led to pressure for new farmland. This created a large class of landless, ambitious young men who had to seek their livelihood outside of Scandinavia.
And the role of political consolidation cannot be overstated, especially for the figures who would go on to found new kingdoms.
That's where the concept of outlawry becomes absolutely central. As political consolidation happened, like Harold Finehair unifying Norway, it often forced powerful local chieftains to flee rather than submit.
Like Rollo, who we'll get to later.
Precisely. If you were declared an outlaw, as Rollo Ganger was in Norway, you were stripped of your social standing, and crucially, you had no fear of kin retaliation for your own killing.
That's a huge psychological shift, knowing you had nothing to lose and were, in effect, already dead to your society.
It created a powerful incentive for foreign adventure. These were men who acquired land, wealth, and status by force because they literally had nothing to go back to. It reframes the whole Viking spirit. It wasn't just aggression, it was an existential need.
Right. And finally, that ambition led to the formalized employment of Vikings as mercenaries.
They were, in essence, highly sought-after medieval contractors, fighting for personal gain and status. They hired themselves and their crews out to powerful nobles in Francia or Ireland in exchange for silver or land.
Is there a specific example of this?
A great one is the chieftain Wayland. He led a marauding band that was hired by West Frankish forces to expel another Viking group that was operating on the Seine River system.
That's fascinating. Norse fighting Norse for money.
And the price was right. Wayland's band demanded a hefty 3,000 pounds of silver to turn their violence on their countrymen. It shows their loyalty was transactional. They were the ultimate free agents of the early Middle Ages.
That adaptability and the sheer volume of people led directly to establishing durable settlements, particularly in the British Isles. The turning point for England wasn't a raid, but a sustained, deliberate campaign of conquest.
Beginning in 865 AD with the arrival of the Great Army.
And Great Army is the right term for it.
It is. This was less an invading army in the modern sense and more a massive, organized collection of war bands and families seeking land, not just loot. The sheer scale of this demographic shift is vital to grasp.
We have numbers.
Well, estimates range dramatically, from about 20,000 to maybe 75,000 men entering between 835 and 876. Even at the lower end, that represents a massive, sustained influx of foreigners into a relatively small kingdom.
And this overwhelming presence forced the establishment of the Danelaw, or denaling, the territory operating under Danish laws. How long did it take Alfred the Great to get a formal boundary?
It was a long struggle that defined his reign. The formal boundary was established after Alfred's crucial victory at Edington in 878 and later codified by the Treaty of Wedmore.
And that line essentially cut England in two.
It did. It included all territory north and east of a line drawn roughly from London to Chester. It created a geopolitical duality in England that persisted for decades. You had two distinct Englands, Anglo-Saxon and Norse.
And the structure of that Norse England was highly centralized, right?
Yeah.
Yes, the administrative and military structure was centered around the five boroughs: Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, Stamford, and Derby.
And these functioned as what, exactly?
As key fortified centers. They were essential not just for military protection against the West Saxons, but also as robust hubs of trade and power. It wasn't a unified Danish kingdom at first, but a collection of regions operating under Scandinavian principles.
The legacy of the Danelaw is truly profound, especially in the English language and law. This is where you can really see the evidence of how many of them settled.
Absolutely. The density of Norse settlement is physically evident today in the place name endings across the North and East Midlands. Suffixes like "myby," meaning village, and "thorp" for hamlet. They are linguistic testaments to the sheer extent of that settlement.
And the legal impact was just as deep.
It was. We see practical friction points between the native Anglo-Saxon legal system and the Norse system. For example, the Viking wapentake, their standard for land division, became functionally interchangeable with the English hundred.
It shows a direct administrative integration.
A negotiation of two systems that eventually formed the bedrock of medieval English common law.
And within that Danelaw, Scandinavian York, or Jorvik, conquered in 866, became the absolute focal point. What do we know about urban life there under Norse rule?
Jorvik was transformed. Archaeological evidence from York suggests that towns within the Danelaw experienced significant urban development and economic expansion under Scandinavian rule. The Norse were consummate organizers.
Also,
They altered the street system, improved infrastructure, and brought tremendous cash and trade, which fueled an economic boom. They used a dual currency system of coinage and Scandinavian-style bullion hack silver until the mid-10th century.
which reflects their widespread trade networks reaching deep into the Baltic and even the East.
Exactly.
The fight for control over what we might call the First England ultimately centered on Alfred's grandson, Aethelstan, who is widely regarded as the first true king of England.
And that struggle culminated in one of the most brutal conflicts of the age, the Battle of Brunanburh in 937. This wasn't a skirmish, this was an existential clash of powers.
Who was involved?
Aethelstan and his half-brother Edmund led a unified army of West Saxons and Mercians against a massive coalition. The threat was immense because Aethelstan was fighting Anlaf, the king of Dublin, leading a host of Vikings alongside the Scots under King Constantine II.
So it was an Anglo-Saxon alliance versus a combined Norse-Celtic alliance.
That's right. I want to spend a moment on the scale of this battle because the sources treat it as almost mythological. It was a massive political turning point.
Why was it so significant?
It demonstrated that the future of England lay with the Wessex dynasty, not with the independent Norse kingdom of Jorvik or the neighboring Celtic kingdoms. The sheer political weight came from the fact that it required a unified English effort to defeat three major enemies at once.
And the casualty list was huge.
The Old English poem in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle relates that 5 young kings, 7 of Anlaf's earls, and countless others were killed. The scope of the casualties was so vast, one Irish chronicle suggests over 34,000 Viking and Scottish losses, which is likely exaggerated but reflects the devastation, that the event was remembered for generations into the Norman period simply as the Great War.
Brunanburh consolidated Ethelstan's control, but Scandinavian power wasn't entirely extinguished until later. Who was the final Viking ruler in York?
That distinction belongs to Eric Bloodaxe, a man with his own complicated history, having previously been king of Norway before being deposed.
He became the final Viking king of York, but his reign was brief.
And tumultuous. Eric was killed in 954, and his kingdom was subsequently taken over by English earls. This event is generally considered the definitive end of the independent Viking kingdom of York.
Looking west now, the Norse impact on Ireland and Scotland was equally transformative. The Vikings regained control of Dublin, or Difflin, and established other crucial settlements.
Yes, places like Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick. But Dublin, in particular, we have to discuss its economic function.
Which was?
It flourished under Viking rule, becoming Western Europe's biggest slave port.
Wow.
It's a grim yet crucial testament to their organizational power and extensive trade networks. They sourced slaves, often from internal Irish conflicts or raids on Britain, and then sold them widely to Scandinavia and, importantly, down the Varangian routes to Islamic markets in the east.
That detail about the logistics really adds necessary texture. It shows Dublin was a major global hub, not just a small settlement.
Absolutely. And this constant close interaction led to significant assimilation. Vikings intermarried extensively with the Irish, adopting elements of their culture, which led to the emergence of the Norse Gaels.
People who combined Scandinavian and Gaelic lineages, language, and customs.
Yes, they were powerful, often volatile rulers of the Irish Sea for centuries.
And further north, the settlement in Scotland was even denser in the islands.
Mhm. Norsemen settled extensively in Shetland, Orkney, the Hebrides, and the Isle of Man. They collectively called them the Sudreys, Southern Isles, and Nordries, Northern Isles,
And similar to Ireland, they integrated with the local Gaelic populations.
creating strong cultural ties and hybrid communities. These territories were eventually governed under the supreme authority of the powerful Earl of Orkney, establishing a lasting Norse presence.
So that gives a clear picture of the chaos and the dynamic state lifting happening around the North Sea. But the Viking phenomenon was truly continental. This success fueled ambition, but for sheer raw wealth, the eyes of many Vikings, particularly from Sweden, were fixed firmly eastward.
Following the river roads, yes, this is the path of the Varangians. Primarily Scandinavians, often referred to as the Russes, who used the vast river systems of what is now Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine.
They called it Gardariki.
They did. They moved along these waterways in extensive portages, aiming southwards, reaching immense markets like the Caspian Sea and the ultimate prize of all, Constantinople.
And moving these ships over land, as we discussed earlier, must have been exponentially more difficult in the east, where the distances were so much greater.
The physical difficulty cannot be overstated. Unlike the relatively short portages in England, the Varangian routes required portaging 5, 6, or 7 times over long distances to connect river systems like the Dnieper, the Dvina, and the Volga. This required a huge organized workforce
Which speaks to their level of organization.
and logistical planning.
The initial political establishment in the East is fascinating, especially the narrative surrounding the invitation to rule.
The Russian Primary Chronicle, a foundational text for early Russian history, recounts how the local Finnic and Slavic tribes initially drove the Varangians out. But then, due to internal disorder, they invited the Roses back with the memorable plea, "Come and rule and reign over us, for our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it."
But that narrative, it comes from a later Christianized source. It smells a bit like soft propaganda designed to legitimize the rule of the later princes. How much of that invitation should we really trust?
That's a fair challenge. While the language of invitation likely sanitizes a much messier process of conquest and subjugation, the underlying truth is that the local populations recognize the Rus' capacity for order, defense, and efficient control of trade routes.
And so Rurik settles around Novgorod, or Holmgarar.
And the Varangians used these waterways not just for local governance, but as high-volume trade routes connecting the West with the vast wealth of the Byzantine and Islamic worlds.
The connection to the Byzantine Empire is perhaps the most glorious aspect of the Eastern expansion. This is where the Varangians cemented their identity as elite Viking mercenaries.
They became absolutely essential. The Varangians were highly sought after by the Byzantine emperors. They offered their unparalleled martial skills in exchange for massive wealth and prestige. They had an aggressive fighting style and a lack of local political ties in Constantinople, which made them uniquely trustworthy to the emperor.
And the career of Harald Hardrada, later King of Norway, is the quintessential path of glory here.
It really is. Harald fled Norway and arrived first at the court of King Jaroslav in Novgorod. He quickly earned a commander's position there before traveling further south to Constantinople,
And there he joined the Byzantine military.
and eventually rose to become the leader of the elite Varangian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguard. This was a position of immense power.
And the sources emphasize the unbelievable wealth generated by this mercenary work.
Indeed. Once established as a separate military unit, the Varangians were paid handsomely. The probable pay rate was around 40 numismata per month, far exceeding the pay of standard imperial forces.
And that wasn't all.
No. They had the right to participate in the division of plunder from campaigns in Italy and Asia Minor, and they often claimed the politismos, the right to loot the imperial palace after the death of an emperor.
Looting the palace after the death of your employer, that's a unique compensation package.
It secured their loyalty, ironically, and Harald Hardrada leveraged this system to the extreme. He amassed great treasure from plunder, which he sent back to Jaroslav and Novgorod for safekeeping.
before eventually returning to Norway.
The saga describes this hoard as being so huge that no one in Northern Europe had ever seen the like of it in one man's possession ever before. It just encapsulates the immense pull the East had for ambitious Viking captains.
Let's pivot sharply back to the west now, specifically the western coast of Francia. Unlike the unified resistance that gradually emerged in England, the Frankish kingdom, especially after the Treaty of Verdun in 843, was inherently weak.
Yes, this constant internal chaos and political fracture left the highly fertile and economically vital Seine Valley severely vulnerable to attack.
And this vulnerability was a magnet for Scandinavian raiders. They brilliantly exploited the navigability of the Seine and its tributaries, allowing them to plunder deep inland.
The raids were relentless and destructive. Rouen itself was attacked and temporarily abandoned as early as 841. Monastic centers like Jumièges Abbey were repeatedly plundered. The economic drain was just destabilizing the whole administration.
And the escalation eventually led them right up to the very capital.
Yes. In 845, Viking fleets sailed upriver to lay siege to Paris under a leader named Ragnar. And again, most famously, they laid siege to the city in 885-886.
And the Frankish rulers resorted to paying tribute, the Danegeld.
They were desperate for temporary peace. But this only proved to the Vikings that organized extortion was more profitable than continuous raiding, creating a devastating cycle that crippled the Frankish economy.
The turning point finally came in Francia in 911. What happened that forced King Charles the Simple to abandon this failed strategy?
A major Viking host, led by the outlaw chief Rollo, clashed with West Frankish forces near Chartres. While the Franks managed to prevent a total disaster, the encounter proved that the continuous Viking presence was an unsolvable strategic problem.
So King Charles, displaying a cynical but brilliant pragmatism, recognized that military victory alone would never end the threat.
He decided to co-opt his enemies.
The result was the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte. This was essentially a deal where Charles outsourced his defense to the Vikings themselves.
That's exactly right. Under the treaty, Rollo and his followers were ceded land around the lower Seine, centered on Rouen, an area roughly equivalent to the northern part of present-day Upper Normandy. It was a calculated risk of real estate for stability.
And in exchange for that valuable territory, Rollo had three crucial transformative obligations.
First, he had to convert to Christianity, formally establishing the duchy as a Christian state from its foundation. Second, he had to swear homage and fealty to King Charles III, thereby becoming a vassal.
And third, and most pragmatic for Charles,
He had to defend the coast against further Viking attacks. This was the ultimate strategic move, using Norse organization and martial ferocity to protect the Frankish kingdom from other Norsemen.
I recall an anecdote related to that homage. Did Rollo actually agree to kneel?
He did not. It's a famous anecdote that perfectly captures the conflict between Viking pride and feudal submission. When Rollo was told he had to kiss Charles's foot, he refused, stating he would never bow to any man.
So what did he do?
He delegated the task to one of his followers, who, either out of intentional disrespect or just clumsiness, raised the king's foot so high that Charles actually fell backward in his seat.
Wow. That refusal to truly kneel tells you everything you need to know about the blend of submission and defiance that defined the early Normans.
Absolutely. And that agreement marked the official founding of Normandy. Rollo became the first Duke of Normandy and Count of Rouen.
How did his successors handle their new state?
Rollo's successors, William Longsword and Richard the Serf, did what Vikings do best. They continued to expand the territory, extending west beyond the Seine. But critically, they strengthened their domain not just through force, but through careful ties with the Frankish royal house. They knew they had to adapt.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh.
How a relatively small settlement of Northmen, granted territory in 911, rapidly transformed over the next century into the sophisticated, influential power known as the Normans. This wasn't just integration, it was a spectacular and fast-paced cultural evolution.
The shifts were immediate and decisive. It shows the Normans' remarkable adaptability. They quickly recognized that political survival depended on adopting the ruling culture. Their conversion to Christianity was formal and immediate.
But the most important shift was linguistic. They renounced Old Norse and rapidly adopted the local Old French language, which evolved into the unique Norman language.
Why such a rapid linguistic shift? In England, the Norse language held on for centuries in the Danelaw.
Several factors. Firstly, the population of Norse settlers in Normandy was likely smaller relative to the indigenous Gallo-Roman population than in the Danelaw. Secondly, Old Norse was primarily an oral culture. It lacks the administrative and religious prestige of written Latin and Frankish.
So adopting Old French was just a practical necessity for administration, commerce, and getting a seat at the table of the Frankish court.
Right, within 2 or 3 generations, Old Norse was essentially extinct in the region. It survived only in place names and isolated legal terms.
This cultural contact has a profound and lasting legacy, particularly for you, the listener, because it fundamentally shaped the English language decades later.
Precisely. The Normans brought this new Gallicized culture and their version of French with them to England in 1066. This language borrowed extensively into English, especially in high-status areas like government, law, war, and domestic life.
Words that define our modern state: justice, authority, felony, parliament, jury, war, victory, all French borrowings that came via this Norman assimilation. It shows the top-down effect of their conquest.
Despite the rapid shift to Frankish culture and law, the early Norman legal system itself was still a unique hybrid.
It was. Norman law was a dynamic blend of Carolingian structures, Frankish traditions, and subtle but persistent Viking influences that define their specific sense of justice.
Do we have specific evidence of that Norse residue surviving in the legal codes themselves?
We do. Even a document from 1050, well after the linguistic shift, mentions banishment using the word ulak. This term comes directly from the Old Norse word for outlaw.
So the concept of being a stateless person, an outlaw, remained a powerful legal category within their administration.
It reflects their own foundational story.
And what about social customs, like marriage? That seems like an area where the church would demand conformity.
This is perhaps the most fascinating survival. The marital custom known as marriage, mordanico, literally, in the Danish manner.
What did that entail?
It allowed for marriage without a formal church ceremony, following older Norse customs, which often allowed for multiple partners or easier repudiation.
How was this tolerated by the Frankish church? That sounds like a major theological problem for a formerly Christian state.
It was a political compromise. The church understood that forcing the powerful early dukes to instantly adopt strict Christian marital practices could destabilize the entire region. The political benefit of stability outweighed the immediate dogma.
So the early dukes used this practice.
The research confirms that the first three dukes of Normandy Rollo, William Longsword, and Richard of Forsall utilized this very practice. They were effectively maintaining a Norse social tradition under a Frankish title.
Finally, we have to highlight the political importance of the duchy before 1066 through matrimonial ties with England. This brings us to Emma of Normandy.
A woman who truly bridges the Anglo-Saxon and rising Norman worlds. Emma was the great-aunt of William the Conqueror. Her political career is a masterclass in medieval diplomacy.
Her initial marriage in 1002 to King Ethelred the Unready.
It was a clear diplomatic move intended to stabilize England against the increasing Viking violence. This move fundamentally embedded Norman power and ambition into the heart of the English court.
She was an incredible political survivor.
A political powerhouse. She was queen consort to two kings of England, Ethelred, and the victorious Danish king Canute the Great, and was mother to two others, Harthacnut and Edward the Confessor. At one time, she was regarded as the richest woman in the country.
Her career illustrates not only the turmoil of the 11th century, but also how the rising Norman power was strategically acquiring influence in the north long before any talk of a military invasion.
Absolutely. By marrying Canute after Ethelred's death, she secured the future of her children and ensured Norman influence remained paramount, whether the king was Anglo-Saxon or Danish.
Her son, from her first marriage, Edward the Confessor, eventually returned from exile in Normandy to claim the throne,
which created the complex web of succession disputes that ultimately set the stage for 1066. This deep, entrenched relationship meant that the Normans didn't arrive as mere opportunists. They arrived as claimants.
If we connect this transformation to the bigger picture, the Normans, while becoming fully Gallicized in language and religion, retained the organizational and expansionist drive of their Viking ancestors.
They successfully channeled that energy, that outlaw mentality, into highly organized military and political ventures. Their new identity was characterized by military strength, specifically developing heavy cavalry, which was superior to the infantry of their rivals.
And they were pioneers in castle building,
introducing the quick-to-build and effective Motte and Bailey style into northern France, which provided immediate territorial control. This adaptability and organizational prowess set the stage for their future dominance, not just in England, but in places like southern Italy, Sicily, and the Crusader states.
So they took the best of Viking ruthlessness and combined it with the best of Frankish structure.
The Viking expansion wasn't just about the terror of a coastal raid. It was a vast, complex economic, political, and demographic movement. And the most successful, most consequential outcome of this initial explosion wasn't found in Scandinavia itself, but in a small corner of France.
Think about how the legacy of an outlawed chief from the north was rapidly assimilated, codified, and transformed into the very DNA of a powerful European duchy, ready to conquer the rest of the known world. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed learning something new. That's all for now, but in case you didn't notice, there are a lot more episodes on this subject available right now. If you're enjoying these historical podcasts, please like and subscribe and share with other history buffs.